Heroes of the Cross, Series 8, Samuel Pollard of Yunnan. Most British boys and girls have been thrilled by the story of the adventures of David Livingstone, that pioneer explorer who penetrated so deep into unknown Africa. This is the story of a boy who also knew of David Livingstone and longed to follow in the steps of his brave adventuring, and who, as a man, became a pioneer for Christ among the people in an unknown corner in the southwest of China. And just one individual like that at the right time can have just massive influence on millions and millions of people. Samuel Pollard was born in 1864 in Cornwall and called after his father, who was a preacher among the people known as Bible Christians. Now, these people are part of the Methodist Church, but in those days they were a little church marked by a tremendous religious fervor and a longing to tell the good news of Jesus Christ everywhere. In Sam's home, worship was held 3 times each day, and the children were able to speak their prayers to the Heavenly Father. In the home, too, as Sam's sister once said, there was plenty of love, but very little money. And when quite a small boy, Sam would run errands to earn a little to help his mother with the housekeeping. He was sent to school in various places where the family lived, and always he watched and learned from his father what it meant to live close to God. One night, when he was 11 years old, Sam's father went to say good night to him and found him still saying his prayers. The father crept away again, and on the night, the boy decided that for the rest of his life he would follow Jesus Christ. Now, we need to make a distinction between what a church may say and what actually seems to be the more direct way of following the example and teachings of certain individuals. The next year, although it meant still more pinching and saving for them at home, his parents sent him to Bible Christian school at Shibare in Devon. There his head was Thomas Ruddle, called Tommy, by the schoolboys, and Sam soon respected him as the clever and fine man he was. Before he went, Sam had promised his father never to fight, a hard promise for a boy to keep, but that did not mean that he was a sissy in any sense of the word. He had a way of turning on anyone with fiery words and flashing eyes, which was often more effective than a mere blow with the fist would have been. Often the look on Sam's face as he turned on him would be enough to silence a boy who was telling a dirty joke or using an ugly word. He had a charming sense of humor all his life, and at school was known for his merry jokes and his good temper when he had the worst of an argument. In his schoolwork, he did well, and at the age of 17, passed a civil service examination and went to London, delighted to be, at last, earning a salary which enabled him to help his parents. Here at church, at Clapham, he, under the influence of the Reverend F.W. Bourne, who made so deep an impression that Sam decided that after all he must give up his post in the civil service and serve God in the ministry. I don't see why people just can't do both. The Bible Christian Church had always been eager to send out men to other countries, and had ministers in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Just at this time, they decided to start a new venture in missionary work in Yunnan, China, and two young men called Thorne and Vanstone were sent out amid great enthusiasm. Very soon Sam wrote to his mother, "Vanstone and Thorne have just left for China, and I shall be next." But she felt she could not let him go. Sam felt quite sure that Christ had called him to China. And although he felt quite unfitted for the task, he was confident that God would guide him to the right preparation. At last, at the close of the year 1885, he went to the watch night service in Clapham. His parents also went to the service in St. Just, Cornwall. And while Sam was praying that he might be fitted for this great adventure, his mother says of herself, "At last, as the old year was passing and the new year entering, I said, 'Lord, I am willing.'" As soon as he received word of her consent, Sam offered to his missionary committee and was accepted. Very soon after, another Shebbear boy, Francis John Diamond, also offered, and in January 1887, they sailed together from Tilbury in the SS Chusson, destined to work in close companionship until Sam's death many years later. Now, it's important that when they organize work that, people pass the test, as in a previous book this month, testing people and training people in doctrine and verses and stuff is important before sending people out. Of course, people should be able to share on what knowledge they do have, what method they do have. The first stage of their journey ended on March 14th when they reached Shanghai, though they still had weeks more of travel before they would arrive at their final destination in Yunnan. They were welcomed at Shanghai by members of the China Inland Mission and remained there long enough to be fitted out with Chinese clothes and with the pigtails that in those days every Chinese wore. Pollard and Diamond had to have them made and tied on behind, but they looked natural enough. Meanwhile, they were able to see something of the wonderful city of Shanghai. The foreign buildings were magnificent, but the countless small houses and streets in the native Chinese quarters, the jumble and jostling throng of rickshaws, carriages, sedan chairs, and wheelbarrows, the crowds and crowds of strange faces were bewildering. Sam felt the tremendous size of the task they had undertaken, and their helplessness in the face of the masses of Chinese with strange faces, strange customs, and a strange landscape. Yet he knew that Christ had said, "Lo, I am with you always," and with the faith that no task is too big for God, he took courage again. First, they were sent to a school in Ganking, 3 days' journey up the great river Yangtze, where a Mr. Baller gave a small group of missionaries their first instruction in the language. Here Sam Pollard was the best student in that little crowd and mastered the intricacies of that difficult language with eagerness. Chinese is made more difficult because there are 4 different tones in which each sound can be said, each one having a different meaning. It was said later that while some missionaries unconsciously waved an arm or moved the head up or down according to the tones, easily and naturally, and without any such trying mannerisms. While still in Genking, Pollard was already starting his work with enthusiasm, as the following extract from one of his letters shows. "I spoke 4 times last week, once going round the preaching room alone. Concertina, Frank's in hand and books under the arm, I sailed up the street and sat down behind the table in the little room. Then I played the concertina, not knowing a single tune. I knew the Chinese are no judges of music. Well, they have their own styles and stuff. So people say, "Oh, country," or it's like, well, what is the message? What is the effect, right? So I pulled the thing in and out, making a rare noise. It had the desired effect. The wild beast was on show free of charge. I invited my audience to sit down. I sang to them and then preached the old story. I told them how my father in England used to tell me of Christ's love until at last I was converted. Because, yeah, you shouldn't be considered of a spiritual path just because of who your parents are. They think a lot of filial piety. One sentence I used, there is not a better man than my father. I expect they thought I was a good son, but I had a good time, and the Lord blessed me very much. I came away praising him. Finally, with Mr. and Mrs. Vanstone, who had come to meet them, they left for their long journey up the great Yangtze Kiang, traveling at first on wide, smiling waters, covered with busy little craft and between fertile banks. At Hankow, they left the steamboat and went by houseboat a fortnight's journey, then procured another boat with 4 rooms to take them the 6 weeks' trip to Chongqing. But now they began to meet the rougher waters in the rapids, and watched with interest, though quite calmly, the efforts of the men to pull the boat through the rushing waters and past dangerous rocks. Finally, they reached Chen Ta'an, a big and famous rapid, and they watched with interest the boatmen letting out the rope to the pullers on shore, and then the boat being pushed into the rapid. Diamond was left sitting at the bows of the boat while the other 3 were inside. Just then, he describes, the current rushing down the inside turned the head of our boat round, and we struck a rock. The boat rebounded and turned over on its side, and in came the rushing waters. Then we had a fight for our lives. The boat was broken to pieces, and all the party were left clinging to the fragments. But all were finally rescued with little hurt, save that Diamond received a wound on the leg from being hurled against a rock. In the water, they lost their precious pigtails, and at first they feared that all their baggage was washed away. But eventually it was salvaged except for 19 cases, some of which were for other missionaries. They managed to get 2 smaller boats to take them on, and on January 7th, 1888 of the Common Era, they left the Yangtze at Chongqing, with quite a sense of relief that the peril of waters was safely passed. After 3 weeks traveling on foot and pony over the roads of Sichuan, they finally entered Yunnan, which had been for so long in Pollard's dreams. Here, the road became mountainous and in places even dangerous. The scenery, Pollard writes, is indescribably grand, up and down cliffs and over rugged rocks. We ride and tramp all day. Once we had to go along a ledge where there was scarcely room to walk. Passing a fine waterfall, I stopped and looked. It almost took my breath away. Dare I take the pony across such a path? One false step and we would have hurled down an abyss. A few moments of nerve tension, and of desperate resolve, and we were over in safety. At last, on February 7th, they climbed on to the great plateau 6,000 feet above the sea, where stood the little city of Chao Taong. Here, in the evening, tired and footsore, in a tiny little Chinese house, they found Samuel Thorne awaiting them, and realized with overwhelming joy that at last they had reached the scene of their work. How different it was from anything Pollard had even imagined. The city so poor, so dirty, so squalid, and the mission house, a wee place with 2 rooms at the front, one of them used as the chapel, then the yard where they kept the pony, and at the back they slept in a little loft reached by a ladder from the study below it. Here Pollard and Diamond settled in together, while Samuel Thorne went to Chongqing to be married. Mr. and Mrs. Vanstone carried on the work at the capital of the province, Yunnanfu. They dressed and ate like Chinese and spent their whole time in preaching or studying the language, gradually realizing how immense was the tasks to which they had set themselves. One day, Diamond returned from preaching with a bad headache and feeling ill, and Pollard, knowing that the nearest doctor was 2 months' journey away, hunted through the books in the house till he found a medical book. After some time, realized with horror that his friend had developed smallpox. Pollard himself writes, "Smallpox, can you imagine it? And in a poor little house at a rent of $7.50 D a week? Was that too much? What does D stand for? Because dollar or dinar sounds like too much, right? But, their currency or something, right? And no doctor nearer than 2 months, and no nurse at hand, and no proper food, and rough boards to sleep on, and half a paper window in the bedroom, and only a ladder by which to reach the bedroom, and the roof so low that in parts of the room you could not stand up, while all day long the sun beat piteously on the tiles just over the bed as if it wanted to take the sick man before he was dead. Pollard acted as both doctor and nurse as the days went by, and Diamond became worse and worse. Despair came upon him. At last, on a Sunday, they both thought that death was very near. Diamond suggested that they should have a little service together, and so they did. In the midst of it, Pollard broke down, but Diamond himself continued. And as Pollard said later, Jesus himself came to us in that little upper room, and we were wonderfully cheered and comforted by his love and presence. From that time, the sick man slowly recovered until when Mr. and Mrs. Thorne returned, the 2 friends were able to take the 13 days' journey to Yunnanfu. On this journey, their luggage was lost, and they had to toil on through rain and mud with only one padded quilt between them at nights. And they eventually reached the great city in safety, and thankful that they were both alive. Well, back in the day, one of the things they talked about having a spouse was somebody to warm your bed. And they meant that literally. Here in Yunnanfu, Pollard continued his studies in Chinese, determined to pass the 6 examinations set by the China Inland Mission. As he studied the classics of Confucius, he realized how enlightened was the thought of a man who could give as a precept, "What you do not wish for yourselves, do not give to others." But, the golden rules, they call it. But turning to the people living in sin and superstition, degraded by opium smoking and heathen practices. Well, heathen really means, they work around the fire. Sometimes it's communal um, projects they have. It's like, what's wrong with having communal projects, right? But he saw how wide was the gulf between their philosophy and their way of life, and longed afresh to give them a doctrine that would bring with it the power to live cleanly and purely. In those days, the missionaries made many mistakes, living among a people who felt that educated men should behave very properly and according to rule. They must often have offended the Chinese feelings about by their hardy methods. But although Pollard's preaching was original and even startling in its style, we read that the Chinese were compelled to listen to him. Determined that he should gain a hearing, he carried round a Chinese gong and sometimes a concertina. Though he could only manage one tune, he preferred the gong, however, and loved to watch the crowds gather as he banged it before starting to preach. He made many tours into the country round Yunnan, as well as working in the city itself. Years later, a young Chinese scholar wrote of his work there. He preached incessantly at the capital, and men laughed at him because they did not understand. But though reviled and persecuted, he was undaunted, for he knew it was the sowing time. Seeing that the people disbelieved, he strove to put forth still greater efforts. Some teachers have come to us, and then resenting the contumely paid to them, they have shaken dust off their feet and retired. Not so did the teacher Pollard. Gradually, though, the Chinese still withheld their belief in his message. They delighted to converse with him, for he never cherished any thought of his own superiority, but treated them as brothers. But going in and among the people of Yunnan, Mr. Pollard made them almost forget that he was a foreigner. While in Yunnan, Pollard had often visited the missionaries at the China Inland Mission, and in September 1890 he became engaged to be married to one of them, Miss Hengi. But before they were married, sorrow had come to the little band of missionaries. The two recruits had been sent out and were at Gunking studying the language when one of them fell ill and died there. During the next year, all the missionaries were feeling the strain of overwork in that climate. Mr. Vanstone was continually fighting malaria, and Pollard himself was urged to take a holiday in the form of a trip to Chongqing to be married before he should break down. Then came the news that Thorne was ill in Chao T'ong, and September 23rd, 1891, he died. Sam Pollard hurried to Chao T'ong to help, but himself was taken ill with malaria and had to make the journey to his wedding by sedan chair instead of horseback. They reached Chongqing safely, however, and made preparations to be married. Pollard was never very smart in his dress, but on his wedding day he must have looked quite fine, for he tells us that this is what he wore: a silver gray silk gown, plum-colored silk trousers tied at the ankles with silk garters, a blue silk sleeveless coat over the gown, and covered by a loose silk jacket of the same color as the trousers, satin shoes to match, and white socks. He doesn't mention how the lady looked or what she wore. It was with great joy that Pollard returned with his wife to Chao T'ong and settled down to work there among all the ignorance and superstition of that city. The Catholics had worked there, but did not often preach in the streets as Pollard did, calling the crowds now with a cornet instead of a gong. In his journal for Saturday, February 13th, 1892, is this entry. On the street today, we were asked twice about sending up foreign lamps. Now, a lot of very useful information about health and all sorts of stuff is encased in what they may be calling superstition. At first, I thought the question must refer to my magic lantern. Now, I find out that the inquiry relates to the two planets in the west, Venus at the top, bright and big, and Jupiter below, somewhat smaller. The Chinese say that these are two lamps, the big one being sent up by the Roman Catholics, and the little one is supposed to be sent up by us, and the two are to fight. And, they don't have to. Each sect can, call forward those who are going to join the wider movement. Although Pollard was no doctor, yet with a few simple drugs and a good deal of common sense, he could do better for the people than the Chinese doctors who were self-trained and ignorant and often inflicted great suffering without healing, or than the wizards who pretended with great noise of drums and cymbals to chase away the evil spirits of disease. Hundreds of people came to the Jesus Hall, as the little mission house was called, for healing, and Pollard gained a reputation even for magical gifts. Often, however, the sick folk who came expecting magic went away filled with a new courage and hope and comfort, just because they had met a man who pitied and loved them. His work at Chao-Tong was not only in the city itself, but in the district, which was so big that it took 10 days to cross in one direction and 6 days in the other. And now, Miss Pollard began to make tours of her own in this district. Pollard missed her, but was of course glad that she should do this work. At the beginning of 1893, he wrote, "I am glad to have spent another year in China. May God give me to dwell many years in this land and work for these poor people." The prejudice of the Chinese was just beginning to be broken down, and in the year Pollard was able to buy a piece of land and build a new mission house with a chapel which would hold hundreds. Before the chapel was finished, Pollard had the joy of baptizing his first 2 Chinese converts. Before a huge crowd, they had to answer the question, "Are you more willing all your lives to serve God with all your heart and mind?" Imagine Pollard's delight when one of them, Young, instead of giving the expected answer, "quite willing," replied boldly, "I am perfectly willing my whole life to serve my Lord Jesus fully." 4 months later, as he lay dying, this Chinese refused with all his strength to have the heathen wizard to drive away the demon, or to smoke opium to ease his pain. Now, those who do such for survival, like smoking's not good for you. You shouldn't smoke any drug, but some of these drugs can be taken other ways too. Smoking only increases the intoxication of the whole thing, but people, if they take their medicine to survive, they have to do this in order to eat. Like was something, this guy was deprived of his one medication, and because of that he was unable to eat right and slowly starved. Finally, on Christmas Sunday, the first services were held in the new mission house, and on Christmas Day a big Chinese feast was given, followed by a magic lantern show. Pollard wrote home, "We all enjoyed ourselves It was the nicest Christmas I think I have ever spent. The following year, because his health was failing, Pollard was sent to Tung Chuang to work, and in 1895, he and his wife and baby returned to England for the first furlough. While at home, he received the report from Yunnan of the work he had left behind and rejoiced to learn that 4 more Chinese at Chao Taong and 15 at Tung Chuan had become Christians. Meanwhile, in China, various events were taking place which were to affect the little band of missionaries in Yunnan. Western countries were bringing to China many new ideas and new plans, and into that great country, which for hundreds of years had been purely Eastern, came telegraph, railways, cotton mills, and soldiers trained like those of the West. Bitterly did many of the old Chinese officials fight against these new ideas, and the Westerners were not always kind in the way in which they introduced the new ideas. Nowadays, it's if the Chinese do it, okay, but if the foreigners do it, or people who aren't purely one of those 52 tribes or a combination thereof, then there's issue in modern China. At length, risings began in different parts of the country, and at last, in 1900, era vulgaris, a great wave of hatred swept across the land, and a determination to kill all foreigners in China, whether merchants, officials, or missionaries. This great movement is known as the Boxer Rising, because the folk who took part in it belonged to a secret society and were called boxers from the queer type of drill which they practiced. And, odd. Not the modern use, right? Although the enmity was hottest in Peking in the north, yet even the Pollards at Chao Taong were in danger. On Sunday, June 14th, 1900, a special messenger arrived with the news that in a riot in Yunnanfu, all missionaries' houses had been looted and the missionaries had narrowly escaped death. Among them, Frank Diamond and his family. An order came from the consul that all foreigners must leave the province, and Pollard called the Christians together and told them the news. He left Mr. Yen and Mr. Li, the preacher and teacher, in charge of the work, and he was delighted when, at the time of enmity against all things foreign and against many Chinese Christians also, 16 people came forward to be baptized before he left. After traveling with a military escort for many days, through floods which washed away one of the soldiers with them, and hindered at one place for a week because one of their children was dangerously ill, they finally reached Hong Kong to receive there the news of how many English missionaries and their families all over China had lost their lives in the massacre. Sam Pollard, however, believed that when all the fury of the rising died down, there would be a fresh enthusiasm for Christianity and greater chances for work than had ever been theirs before. And the following year, as he returned to his work, he heard on every hand news of the fresh awakening in all parts of China. At one place he wrote, "A gentleman, a Chinese official, has offered 1,000 ounces of silver a year if the Methodists will send a missionary to open a school in his town." Again he writes, "Good news comes also from Huaichao, which is right east of Yunnan. Last year, in 2 of the districts, 34 Christians were put to death and hundreds were fined, but the sons of the faithful martyrs all went to follow the Lord Jesus. The persecution has fixed the feet of these Christians firmer upon the book." So, the good work goes on. On his return to Chao Leong, he was given a feast of honor by the mandarins and officials in that city, a great contrast to the prejudice they had shown in earlier days, and another sign that the people were ready and willing to hear and receive more of Christianity. Pollard longed for a large staff of men to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity, but no one else could be spared from their present work. He arranged, however, for a series of tours to the country districts to found churches there, in the hopes that with the help of his Chinese colleagues, he might achieve some lasting effects. Everywhere they were welcomed. Often the people had prepared a chapel for them to use and were willing to listen to all they had to say. At one place, the people decided to give up their idols. Mr. Lee, one of Pollard's helpers, spoke of the gods, pointing out their lack of powers to help the people. And then the great images were taken out, piled up, and burnt. And that sort of test can fail any group, is when they expect, the forces to be ordered around to perform what they want materially. In all these travels, Pollard's companions were impressed with his patient endurance of the hardships on the road. Mr. Lee said years later he was not covetous. His clothing, food, and dwelling were of little consequence to him and were scarcely in his thoughts. What occupied his mind was the extension of the kingdom. Returning after one of the tours, Poland found a letter from his brother giving news of his father's death. He was stricken with grief, but then remembered the joy it meant for his father and was able to rejoice. He felt, too, very much, the sacrifice in leaving his wife and boys behind, and often worried because they missed the companionship of other English children. Between them and the Chinese among whom they lived were still so many differences. Pollard writes in one place, "A woman came a few days ago and admired Bertram, who was then 4 years old, and asked Miss Pollard if she had found a wife for him yet." People arrange marriages before, they're going to be consummated, even before the pregnancies occur. During some of his trips in Yunnan, as he sat chatting in the homes of the people, Sam Pollard would often hear the Chinese mention the people who lived on the land the other side of the Yangtze River and across the La Liang Shan, the great cold mountain. The Chinese called the folk Munzi or Lolo, the first meaning wild men, the second really the name for little baskets which they used in their ancestor worship. Pollard heard many strange and blood-curdling tales of these wild men, and his curiosity and his natural love of adventure prompted him to want to explore their land and meet the people. Actually, these wild men are one of the tribes which long ago, as Chinese invaders advanced, were gradually driven back from the coast and the plains to live their own independent life among the fastnesses of the mountains, just as the Bretons and Welsh were driven back by the Anglo-Saxons in this land of ours. There, among those hills, which are really Chinese territory, this tribe lives in independence with a government very much like the feudal system that we learn about under William the Conqueror in England. A fine, wild, strong people they are, and their real name is the No-Su. The other names used by the Chinese being nicknames given in hate and derision, and which the No-Su themselves hate to hear. Like you hear of the squaw and the Apache and some other things that have nothing to do with their real names of Native American tribes. They have as tenants are underlords, either Chinese or people of another tribe, the Miao, simple folk who live a poor, evil life. Well, why are they evil? Yet fond of music and dancing. Well, Okay, well, the Bible would condemn the whole musical instruments and dancing thing much more stronger. That people say, oh, the Muslims are going to destroy the musical instruments. Have you read the Bible? And looked at Christendom, at how times they would force the stopping of dancing, even dancing that didn't have inappropriate touching. Both these tribes are quite different from the Chinese people in dress and custom and in life, but while in their own land the No-Su are lords, and the Chinese traveling there must be careful to be polite and well behaved, and the Miao he despises as his inferiors. In the year 1903, Pollard planned to cross the Yangtze and to make a trip over the Great Cold Mountains into the land of the No-Su. He could not have done this but for the help of a No-Su chief called Long, who lived on Chinese territory. 3 days' journey from Chao to Ong, they went at first to the home of this chief, from which they were later to set out secretly for the Great Cold Mountains. Pollard describes his view of the No-Su land from there. On Sunday morning, we went out and sat on the hillside, gazing intently at the mountains of No-Su land and wondering what we should find there if we succeeded in getting over the Yangtze ferry. The hills on that side were very like the hills on which we were resting, and yet the fact that no European had ever been among them invested them with a romantic interest, such as the hills we were well acquainted with did not possess. The unknown was calling us, and we longed to jump across the great valley and land straight away among the brave men who had held their own so long against all efforts to dislodge them. The No-Su who prepared to accompany Pollard were well armed, but he refused to take weapons, knowing that friendship and the message he brought were the weapons of love he wanted and needed to use. He had, however, a telescope and a camera with him. The Chinese called the telescope 1,000-mile glass. My men, he says, altered the last word to gun, and I found out later that they had told marvelous stories of what this gun would do. It would kill all that it would see up to the distance of 1,000 Chinese miles. Fortunately, the gun never went off, and there was never an occasion on which we needed to fire it, even in imagination. As to the camera, the role it was supposed to fill on occasions was that of a machine gun of marvelous magic power, under the direction of the man who retired beneath the dark cloth. As my companions spun these yarns about the telescope and camera, I could easily see that a feeling of confidence was coming over them, and that they were facing the dangers of the unknown with comparatively light hearts. They climbed with difficulty down to the Yangtze and slept beside the ferry, where they hoped to cross next morning. In the town, their Pollard met many of the No-Su, tall, fine men with fairer hair than the Chinese, wearing long gray felt cloaks, hanging from neck to knees. And we have David Hill, which we talked about in the last program. The last couple. Here at the ferry, they met with difficulties, for some of Long's enemies were in the place and determined to prevent them crossing into No-Su land. First, they planned to loosen some boards from the bottom of the boat and let the whole party drown in the river. This they were prevented from doing by one of the men in the party, and so, in spite of various threats and entreaties, they boarded the boat and crossed the river safely. Pollard says, as we stepped ashore, I remembered that I was a missionary, and being such, the first thing that I did was to take off my hat and pray that peace and salvation might come to the land where dwelt people so despised by the Chinese. And Islam spread in India much the same way as the lower classes found respect and equality. The first part of their journey lay through territory infested with robbers, and long told them to keep together. And we have the feeding refugee children. The road was terrible. We had left our horses, says Pollard, in Yunnan, resolved to walk, and were glad now we had done so. Sometimes the way was but a few ledges cut in the rock. At other times a log was thrown against a cliff, and a few notches cut in it to help climbers. Logs were placed from ledge to ledge, and over these we had to walk or crawl. Pollard had to take off his English boots and wear the hemp sandals that Nosu use. They stopped for the night at a village, and the next morning a chief called Vriha came to see them and insisted that they should have a meal at his expense. He sent for a goat, and the party waited while it was killed and cooked. Pollard amusing them with some small things he had with him. The greatest fun of all, he says, was when I showed them a couple of working figures, a Chinaman with a sword and spear and a dancing fiddler. How they roared and roared with laughter. At noon they went on along more rough paths. At one place there was a ledge so narrow and dangerous that even the monkeys are said to put on sandals before they venture to walk over its slippery sides. That night they were entertained royalty once more, though Pollard was horrified to see his hosts bring in a live goat and proceed to kill and prepare it there before his eyes. It was considered polite to give each party of guests a freshly slaughtered animal, and so the dinner is killed in their presence to make sure that there is no doubt about it. You see similar manners in the Bible. Pollard was invited to eat that meal with wooden spoons out of wooden bowls, and some of the pieces of meat were over a pound in weight. How did we manage? He says. Let the reader guess how he would manage, and that will be just as we managed. At the time, of course, Pollard was unable to speak to his Nosu hosts, except when some of his own party translated for him into Chinese. Many were the tales of him that his own party told to their tribesmen, and he was thought to be capable of all sorts of magic. One night he spent at Vriha's home. Outside all was snow and ice, and inside Pollard sat by a blazing log fire, and opposite him, Vriha's sister, a handsome girl of 17. There was a great deal of conversation, evidently concerning him, and Pollard asked if he might hear what they were discussing. To his horror, he had heard that they were so pleased with him that they decided to give him, the chief's sister, as his wife. Why not take that, right? Pollard slept little that night, wondering how to release himself from this dilemma without offending these people, whom he wished to win. Well, the Bible doesn't stop polygamy, If he knew his Bible better, he'd be like, okay, it helps spread the message and peace and all that, At last, he explained that under the law of his country, he was allowed only one wife, and he did not wish to bring dishonor on the girl. Fortunately, they accepted his explanation, and he escaped a Nosu wife. When they returned, plots were again made to prevent them from crossing the river, but with Chief Long's protection, they managed it safely. Later, the Chinese attempted to make trouble for Chief Long on account of his share in the expedition, but at Pollard's intervention, it was prevented. In the following year, all Pollard's efforts at traveling out to seek for the tribesfolk of the hills were overwhelmed by a wonderful movement, unexpected and yet gloriously full of meaning and opportunity. On July 12th, 1904, 4 strangers walked into the courtyard of the mission house at Chao Taong. They were dressed in Chinese clothes but looked very tired and shy and carried bags of oatmeal over their shoulders. That's how I want to be graded, right? If I'm going to be graded with any, actually, there's grains I like better, but that's the one I think I can eat the most of. They were members of that simple, ignorant tribe. The Miao, some other tribesfolk, had met Mr. Adam of the China Inland Mission and had gone back with a marvelous story of the foreigner and his wonderful religion. These men had traveled 200 miles to the city of Anshuan to find him and beg for teaching about the Jesus religion. He had sent them on to Pollard at Chao Taong, which was only 2 days' journey from the home of one of them. Pollard received them gladly, of course, but little did he realize then what that visit meant for the great movement that was upon them. Throughout the hamlets, among the mountains of Huaichao, the northeast, Yunnan, there swept the thrill of a new hope. The simple-hearted, ignorant folk had conceived of better life than that to which they had been accustomed. Excessive toil, tempered with drunkenness and indulgence, had already impaired their vigor and reduced their numbers. But now they were filled with wistful yearnings. A few had heard the strange, alluring doctrine of a God who was the Father of all men, and the fascinating story of the Heavenly Father's Son, who was the greatest elder brother of the Me'ao. In increasing numbers they came to Chao Taong begging to be taught. The greatest difficulty, of course, was that of language. Pollard would pick on one who knew some Chinese and use him as an interpreter, trying to tell these simple, ignorant folk about their Father in heaven, even when they had listened eagerly and understood. If questioned an hour later, they would have forgotten all they had been told. Yet they were hungry for knowledge. They would pounce upon anyone who could tell them about Jesus and beg to be told, and always they were talking about the thousands back in the hills who wanted to hear but were too frightened to come all that way. The crowds in the mission at Chao Taong became almost too much for the missionary. Miss Pollard grew anxious about her husband's health, and one day permitted him to go and lie down. He did so, and locked the door to the stairway, pocketing the key. After a time, she crept up to see if he were resting, and was astonished to find a dozen Miao standing around the bed, reading their books under his guidance, and thinking themselves among the favored of earth to have the teacher all to themselves. These zealous pupils had sealed the balcony and sought him in room after room until they discovered where he was. It was a terrific situation and not an easy one to face, with all the regular work of the mission to be carried on at the same time. But Pollard was determined not to lose the opportunity, which he felt had come from God. He and his Chinese friend Stephen Lee set themselves to learn the Miao language, and within a few weeks were able to give simple speeches to the tribesmen in their own tongue. They wrote Bible stories in the simplest of Chinese characters for the Miao to read, for they had no written language of their own. At Christmas, Pollard arranged for a feast for the Chinese Christians and the Miao inquirers. Crowds came and were given a feast on December 23rd and 24th, and on Christmas Day, 7 services were held, 3 for Chinese and 4 for Miao. Pollard wrote, in the evening the chapel was packed with Miao, and we had a fine time. One after another spoke with evident power. What are we to do with all these people? Meanwhile, what did the non-Christian Chinese in Nosu think of this new movement among the Miao? Can you imagine how in the old slave days their masters would have regarded such a rising among their slaves in the spectacle of an ignorant, frightened, cowed people suddenly filled with new hope, new joy, new courage? They could see not a miracle from God, but a menace to their own power and authority. Pollard tells us everybody was asking, what means this unrest among the Me'a'o? Why are these long lines of aborigines, original inhabitants? They typically only do that with the Americas and the Australia when they call people aborigines, but Australia most of all, going every day to the foreigners' homes. Now came the chance of the busybodies, of the scandal mongers, of the ignorant gossipers, of the ignorant gossipers. Before long, it was whispered that in the Me'a'o meditated rebellion and wholesale massacre. It was stated that the foreigners were supplying each band of Me'a'o with bags of potent poison, so the oatmeal, right, which the Me'a'o were casting into the wells so that the Nosu and the Chinese might be killed off, leaving the land for the Christians. What was at first whispered in the homes later on became public talk on the markets, and consequently a great fear filled the hearts of many. Reports came from all sides of the cruel and fierce attacks on the Me'a'o at the markets, on the roads, all of them being beaten, chained, and ill-treated because of their connection with the mysterious foreigner. The mandarin of a district full of Me'a'o was an ignorant man and took a violent part in the opposition. What was to be done? Pollard decided to go himself to the place and show the people what he was, and so try to allay their fear and suspicion. With a letter of introduction from the friendly magistrate at Chao Ta'ong, he made his way there, only to find the mandarin was away from home some days' journey. He was able, however, to make peace over the telegraph. A proclamation, he says, was drafted beginning with the words, "Whereas we have repeatedly received imperial edicts commanding us to protect the foreign men, we ask the official to strike out the last two words and insert Christians instead." And he did so. We were not anxious about the foreigners, but we were about the converts. All through the Me'a'o district he traveled, breaking down the prejudices and fears that the Nosu landlords and persuading many of them to allow him to preach to their retainers. At one place, he had to correct a rumor that the Me'a'o were poisoning the streams. Several different families in the same place had been ill and were of the opinion that the water they drank had been poisoned by the Me'a'o. Pollard visited them and then asked to be taken to the well from which the stream flowed. There, right beside the well, stood a heap of manure which the rain was washing into the well. After a time, he persuaded the people to believe that there was quite sufficient cause for the illness among them. Pollard found, as he traveled, that the stories of these first four Me'a'o were true. There were literally thousands among the hills longing for the gospel, and still they continued to pour into Chao Ta'ong and live there in the mission until the fear of the spread of disease and the danger of fire among those crowds worried the members of the mission staff and made it imperative that something should be done. Pollard says in his story of the Me'a'o, "What were we to do with the crowds? We could not tell them not to come. There is no stopping a revival. We did not want them to stop, even if we could have done so. There was one thing, however, we could do, and that we did. We referred this difficulty to him who had created it and asked him to solve it. Of course, he did so. 2 days' journey from Chao to Ong lived a landlord who had the reputation of treating his tenants well and kindly. He was anxious that the Me'ao should not go to the city in case they lost their simple ways and become difficult to rule. So he offered the mission a piece of land on which to build a chapel for the Me'ao themselves. Several places on his big estate were visited and inspected, but none seemed quite the right place until he presented some land at a place called Stone Gateway. The land stood on a hill, and that Me'ao at once professed their approval, for they knew what the foreigner did not, that the hill was made of lovely, smokeless coal, and that the chief allowed anyone living there to use it freely. The coal would serve to keep them warm when they gathered for meetings in the winter time, clad in their poor thin clothes without sufficient bedding. The present of this land seemed a wonderful way out of the difficulty, and the other missionaries also took their part on solving the problem. Although it was to mean more work for them all, when already burdened, they set Pollard free to become the special missionary to the Me'ao and to leave Chao to Ong and settle at the Stone Gateway. The remaining difficulty was that of funds to do the building, for there was no money from England for this work. The Me'ao themselves were terribly poor. Pollard says that their average income for a year was about £3 in English money, but he laid the difficulty before the Christians, and they promised to give all they could. Their giving was a real sacrifice for them, and the result was that a chapel was built. Its walls were of mud, and its roof at first of grass, which let in the rain in large quantities. They started, however, to make their own tiles so the roof could be made more weatherproof. When it was finished, the chapel would hold 350 people sitting, but on the great days when the crowds were overwhelming, it would be cleared of seats and 2 meetings held. The first of about 600 women with their babies, the second of 700 men. These folk stood all the time without room to move, but the fervor. When Mr. Lee, Poland's friend, announced a well-known hymn, was enough to lift the roof. A school was started, first for day pupils, but later as a boarding school. Some rooms for teachers and workers were erected, and gradually a little group of buildings grew on the hillside, visible for miles because of their whitewashed walls, a landmark on those rugged hills. One of the buildings was a wonderful £5 house for the missionary, the money for which was given by the Me'ao Christians. It had 3 rooms, and the back wall was the mountain itself. In the center room, Pollard slept, washed, ate, and studied. Here were kept all the medicines, and sick folk were seen. Here was the library of Chinese and Me'ao treatments and pamphlets. Here was the strong box full of coppers, and the pantry for the whole house. When it was finished, Miss Pollard and 2 of the boys came up to live there, even before the windows were put in, and they slept that night in the knowledge that all around them on the mountains were wolves, all around them, leopards, and two man-eating tigers. Later, Miss Pollard had to leave, and Mr. and Mrs. Parsons came to live there as a young couple. Of the rooms was all that they could call their own, but many happy days were spent there in work among these people. Pollard was anxious that other centers should be opened where the Me'ao could go for worship, as they did to Stone Gateway, but he found difficulty among many of the Nasu landlords in procuring land. Before long, however, 2 more chapels were built, one at Rice Ear Valley, 30 miles northeast of Stone Gateway, and one at Long Sea, 60 miles to the southeast. Here, too, the poor, sick, ignorant folk crowded in, longing to hear all that the missionary and his helpers could tell them, and some very wonderful services were held. But Pollard soon heard of fresh hostility in various places, and stories of how the Me'a'o Christians were being terrorized and threatened. Rumors came too of threats to his own life, but of these he took little noise, merely being a little more careful than before. He determined, however, to go and see about the trouble and try to restore peace and protection for his Christian Me'a'o. In April 1907, he reached a place called Ha-Li-Mi and was entertained by a Me'a'o there. During the evening meetings, shots were heard outside, but his host told Pollard that there was a sick man near, and his friends were trying to drive away the devils. Actually, they were signals for the gathering of men bent on killing the missionary. He went to bed with his 3 Me'a'o helpers and to sleep. We have his own account of what happened later from a letter sent to the consulate in Yunnan. At midnight, the continuous barking of dogs woke us up, and soon afterwards there appeared a lot of lights around the small house, practically a hut in which I was staying. The unfastened bamboo door was pushed open, and I saw a crowd of armed men with torches. They were shouting for me. I asked a Me'a'o what it meant. He quietly answered, "Capture, murder." I hurriedly slipped on my gown, and as there was no possible way of escape, I went out to them and was immediately surrounded by 60 armed men. Well, if you call it murder, you're admitting that you're doing wrong. So if they thought it was the right thing, they probably wouldn't have used something that translated quite as murder, right? 3 Me'a'o had come with me, and these also the enemy were determined to get. And as soon as we got outside, they began beating these Me'a'o. Left out. A minute or two afterwards, we came to a bank with a stream below, or maybe that's for effect. Sentence is left out. And they again began to beat one of my men and knocked him down the bank. In the confusion, I thought I might escape, so I jumped the bank and ran down the stream. The crowd rushed after me and forgot my Me'a'o, who went the other way and got clean off. I did not give them a very long run, but they headed me off with cries of beat, kill. They got me fairly in the bed of the stream and then began to beat me with great force and anger. I expected every blow to be my last. They used iron weapons as well as clubs to beat me. Just as Pollard expected every minute to be his last, a man dressed in a sheepskin stooped and put his arms around him, shielding him from the blows with his own body. The crowd ceased to beat him, but dragged him to a walnut tree some distance away, and there tried him, finally telling him that he must not come there again, on pain of death. Later he was carried back to the Me'a'o hut, and there lay, while his Me'a'o friends took the news of what had happened. Back to the hospital at Cha'o Ta'ong, he was carried there on a litter, and for days lay on the brink of death, but at last slowly recovered. The doctor ordered him to settle his affairs and return to England as soon as possible. Miss Pollard and the boys were already there, and Pollard's heart was partly with them and partly with this Me'a'o, many of whom wept when they heard that their beloved teacher was leaving them. He paid flying visits to many of the centers, baptizing converts and helping Christians in various ways, and was greatly cheered by all the signs of progress that he met. In 1908, Pollard returned to England for his second furlough, and during the year which followed, he traveled all over the country telling the story of his work and firing with enthusiasm many of the young people. His great plea was for more missionaries to go out and help in that great work When he returned, he was overjoyed to take with him a young man called Hudspeth, who was to share much of his life through the next years. After his return, he once again visited the Me'ao churches. At some, he met with disappointment and found the buildings in ruins and the members cool and uncaring. At others, though he was welcomed by crowds who came to worship, we read one beautiful prayer uttered by a woman: "Comfort all those who have lost their little ones. Send thy Holy Spirit upon them. Also, give us thy Spirit and thy glory. Save the whole of China. Save us, for we are fools and stupid." Looks like jewels and stupid, knowing nothing. Help us, therefore, to know him who died for us, that we may come, O Father, to thee. Accept our thanks for bringing the preachers here, all the more that they have not come tired. In the sweet, fragrant name of Jesus, we make all our requests. Now remember Matthew 7:22-23 about the doing things in the name of Jesus, how he said this is outside of his law, and that he had never known anybody like them. And, he's prophesying that he's going to testify, hey, I didn't know anybody like this. These weren't people who knew me. And that stuff about taking up your cross and following him, I don't know, that looks almost like he's on a toilet or something, but maybe it's just a regular seat. I don't know. Once more, he heard rumors of hostility among the No-Su landlords, and one wet night, having fled from their enemies, he and a doctor slept in a terrible hut which they called the Waldorf. Oh, maybe that's what the illustrations are. The doctor writes, "In our royal room were 9 men sleeping on the floor, 1 horse, 3 cows, 9 goats, 5 pigs, 1 cat, 1 firefly, and 2 foreigners. The firefly fluttered all over the place. The goats snored all night long. My bed was too short, and a sour smell pervaded the place." By this time, Pollard realized that all the work he had done among the Me'ao might fail if he did not take steps to teach some of them to be preachers and teachers of their own people. The Christians who now thronged the little white chapels would one day die, and who could tell if the message of Jesus would be passed on to those who followed them? You will remember that when those first Me'ao came to Pollard, they had no written language, and that most of their books had to be written in simple Chinese. Pollard saw that what they really needed was a written language and then a copy of the Bible, or at any rate a New Testament in that language. He heard that a gentleman in England had left a sum of money for the tribesmen in China, and he managed to procure some of this money for the Me'ao at his own work on condition that he translated the New Testament into their own language. To do this, Pollard had first to give them a written language of their own. He and his friend Mr. Lee worked and thought it out for a long time. They decided that Chinese characters were far too difficult for the simple Me'ao folk and had to discover something that they could easily learn to read. They might have written the sounds in our English letters and taught them to read these, but the Me'ao language is musical and contains many of those tones we hear about in Chinese. How was Pollard to write these tones on paper? He decided in the end to use a sort of shorthand in which the consonants remain the same and the vowel signs can be placed higher or lower beside them according to the tone. And the best way for such to be passed on is that people actually learn it and pass it on, not just, oh, well, let's make sure to get things in the books so we can pass around the books. In his work of translating the New Testament, he had the help of a Me'ao assistant. Pollard describes in his journal how impressed the man was with many of the stories in the Gospels. When translating the passage describing how Jesus took a little child into his arms and used him as a text to teach the disciples from. My assistant pressed me to add the word kissed to the translation. I said it was not there. My friend said, it must be there. Jesus must have kissed the little one. He could not have helped it. In the West, we stepped away from that even before some of the problems that now are mostly American problems. I mean, compared to the rest of the world. A little bit, well, a huge bit Israeli and a huge bit Irish too. But, to Pollard, this great task was joy, but it called forth all the best learning and thought that he could give to it. Over and over again, he said how much he hoped to live until he could finish the task. His wish was granted, though it was after his death that the last chapters were printed, at the same time as Pollard was translating the New Testament. A big school was built for Me'a'o at Stone Gateway. He also planned a training school for Me'a'o preachers, so there should always be some of their own people to carry on the work of preaching and teaching. But Pollard was beginning to feel old and tired, and the result of his life of hardship was showing itself. And then typhoid fever broke out in the schools at Stone Gateway, and several of the pupils caught the disease. Mr. Hudspeth undertook to nurse them, and did so until he himself took the infection. And once Pollard began to nurse him and continued faithfully as the disease took its course, though he confessed that the nursing made him tired. Just as Mr. Hudspeth began to recover, he himself went down with the disease. Miss Pollard was with him at the time and able to nurse him, but Pollard was so tired that he never expected to recover. On September 15th, 1915, he passed away. As he lives, says Mr. Hudspeth, so he died. It was this unselfishness, this love of others, that cost him his life. Miss Pollard nursed me, but after 14 days he became ill and alas was unable to endure the strain. It came as a great shock to me, for he was in one room and I in the next. Though I knew he was ill, I had no idea of what was coming. He passed into eternal rest just as I was beginning to recover. One of the things is we don't actually know. You can say people translated to the other world, but, the Me'a'o chose his grave high up on a hillside among the oak trees. Now, the people who lived amongst oak trees in Europe were called Druids, because Druid is Gaelic for oak tree. There they buried him, and there now stands a stone with an inscription in English, Chinese, and Me'a'o. There lies his body, but his spirit will live for many years, perhaps forever, in the hearts of those people of the hills whose hero he was for Christ's sake.